the fact that in 1929 you could have that salty. I mean, I'm always amazed, right? When you look at images, right, from various time periods, right, you always have this kind of impression that they're psychologically less rich, less complex than you are. And then you do something like you read the poetry, you read the novels, and you understand that they understood more or less what you understand, right? Just through a different filter.
Oh my God.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to ArtiFact number 37. I am Alex Sheremet, and I am joined by Ruslan Gallopyn over in Belgium. We've actually been talking on and off for a little bit, and we were talking about this novel, Some Prefer Nettles by Junichiro Tanizaki. And this is actually one of my favorite books, right? I read it for the first time. It was over 10 years ago, but it's probably maybe my fifth or sixth time reading it now. And somebody in the comments, maybe a year ago or so, someone suggested, hey, can you do Some Prefer Nettles, right? That's one of my favorite books. I forget who it was, but I was sort of planning on doing it. Ruslan agreed to do the show. So we're going to be discussing this book, right? It's only about, my edition is 202 pages, right? So it's not too long, but just reading it now, right? There's so much going on structurally. There's so much going on, just kind of, sentence by sentence, just the prose is beautiful. There's so much going on, not only in characterization, but very kind of sneaky ways that Tanizaki, who he's always had this kind of like a set of like aesthetic fixations. He wrote this one book. I forget if it's like called In Praise of Shadows or something else. In Praise of Shadows. Okay, yeah. I read that. I don't remember getting that much out of it because it was kind of like, it struck me as his own sort of like personal, peculiar aesthetic fixations, and not so easily to extrapolate that into, art consistently. But here it seems like some of his own aesthetic fixations, whether it's like a puppet theater or something else, although there's a lot of that going on here, it's used for a very specific purpose, which is to get into the minds of the characters, right? And to really explore in a kind of symbolic way their own hangups, right? Their own issues, their sort of permutations throughout the text from beginning to end, right? All these character arcs. So that's a very fascinating way of like maybe placating some of your own personal desires, right? Artistically, while also ensuring that, the reader gets a lot out of this. And Ruslan and I are actually going to do an after show for patrons, right? So that's patreon.com/automachination. We're going to discuss the Bergman film, the 1980 film, I believe, from the life of marionettes. I actually saw it the second time watching it. A fascinating little tidbit. Oftentimes when I watch movies twice, I forget that I had seen it before, and it's only like maybe 15 minutes in. Like I was watching with my wife last night, and she was like, we saw this movie. And I was like, what? I was looking for this movie for a while. I couldn't find it. She's like, no, we saw it. And this is what happens. And it was only like 20 minutes in. I was like, oh yeah, I remember this. Right. So I don't know if you have that experience, but oftentimes I just don't remember movies until I see them a second time. Like when Jessica Schneider wrote for Automachination her review of Bergman's Winter Light, I was like, all right, before posting her article, let me watch this movie because I've never seen it before. And then I sat out, I was like, 20 minutes in, I was like, no, I did see this before, right? So this is a very frequent occurrence to me. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about so both of us are right. We were born in the Soviet Union, so we're going to talk about Soviet culture, Soviet upbringing, maybe some Russia, Ukraine stuff. I have an interview coming up with a Ukraine expert sometime in the next couple of weeks, so maybe we could sort of hash out also some additional questions to discuss, and plus a bunch of other topics. I mean, these shows are always kind of long, kind of wild. So, I mean, that should be good. I'm not sure if Ruslan, you have anything else to say by way of introduction.
No, just thank you for having me. So Some Prefer Nettles, it's a It's a great book, and I came across it from a review of Jessica Schneider on the Cosmoetica website. I was just hunting for great books, and yeah, it's a pretty short one. In my edition, it's only 150 pages, so it's a quick read, but it has packs a big punch. It's a really great novel. Yeah, I guess let's get into it.
Okay. All right. So I mean, every single time that I read, I definitely notice stuff that I haven't noticed before, right? I mean, if you're dealing with a great work of art, you need to be able to not only be open to that, but also understand that this will happen, right? The reason why you would reread is to notice things that you didn't notice before. It could be, a line that you hadn't noticed before. It could be, something about the characterization, right? And one thing that I wanted to focus on now, right, upon rereads, it could get kind of difficult to really understand what's happening from chapter to chapter in terms of like structurally, simply because it's such a kind of like tightly constructed novel, right? It's very seamless, right? By it being difficult, I don't mean that like you can't follow. It's actually very easy to follow, but the fact that it's so seamless makes you maybe take for granted how tightly constructed it is structurally. But, of course, for it to feel seamless, for it to be seamless, it needs to be constructed that tightly. And even just starting from the first chapter. So like this book, I believe it was published in 1929. 29. Okay. Yeah. 1929. Yeah. So interestingly, like you would maybe at the time, I'm not sure maybe how Japanese people were feeling then, Japanese artists, that kind of thing. But, of course, soon we were going to have the Japanese emperor make an alliance later on with Nazi Germany, right? There's going to be World War II. There's not actually a lot of politics in the book, right? In fact, there's almost no politics with the exception of this totally like almost throwaway line near the end of the novel where one of the chief characters, Kaname, he visits a prostitute, and there's some kind of comment from the narrator that starting in 1918, it's native Japanese people that started crowding out all the foreign kind of, prostitution firms or whatever, right? This idea of this like growing nationalism, the sense of like we could actually, stand up for ourselves in whatever kind of twisted way that might come out, and ultimately did. But I found that kind of a bit fascinating, right? A lot of people might complain about the fact that, oh, there's not enough politics, and we're talking about right before World War II. How dare you not even assess it? But really, like, think about it. Even if we were to concede that all of this is so hugely important, the fact that the characters are so kind of, they're such like dilettantes, right? And they're so far away from any kind of like real life troubles, right? Given their kind of status in life, right? They have a ton of money. It's not clear at all what they do, right? There's another throwaway line where it's like Kaname has to show himself once a week at the office. Like, what office? What does he do once a week? How has this come to this kind of arrangement, especially in a kind of difficult work ethic? Even in Japan at the time, it was still kind of a difficult work ethic, right? So all these like little things, right? Like there are political comments, but they are very subtle, right? And you have to have your mind attuned. It could be attuned to politics, that's fine. But if you're not attuned to the arts, right, you're actually going to miss some of the things going on underneath the surface, right? And what this really says about, the kind of like human disconnect that these characters are feeling. But maybe before I get into chapter one, like, was there anything about the chapter that you saw that you highlighted, whether it's like, I don't know, passages or anything that you thought worthwhile talking about?
No, like you said, there's not a lot of politics in it, but I think there's like politics, like broad politics. There's the East and the West going on there, and it's basically the main characters pulled to either like sort of conservatism to narrow his world, or or broaden his world, become more progressive, looking towards the future. So he's basically stuck between those two lines of thought for his divorce. So that's what I saw in there. It was like a broader politics. You can extrapolate that and make it like larger than just his personal choices. So that was pretty interesting, certainly in light of the coming World War. There's just the situation that he sketches, namely there's a like a divorce. He doesn't know if he wants a divorce, but it's also a sort of open marriage, which is very like a very modern situation. I wouldn't expect it to see it in a Japanese novel from the 1920s, let alone any novel from the 1920s. So that points towards something, I guess.
Well, let's see how Tanizaki treats all this, right, in the first couple of pages. I mean, like, let's just kind of read through this, right? You want to just grab that, maybe let's say the first page, second page, down to when we discover, and this is the critical thing, right? We don't discover much about the divorce until like a couple of pages in, right? Like I think that construction is really wonderful. If you want to take it away from the top.
You think you might go then? Misako asked several times during the morning. Kaname, as usual, was evasive, however, and Misako found it impossible to make up her own mind. The morning passed. At about 1 o'clock, she took a bath and dressed, and, ready for either eventuality, sat down inquiringly beside her husband. He said nothing. The morning newspaper was still spread open in front of him. Anyway, your bath is ready. Oh, Kaname lay sprawled on a couple of cushions, his chin in his hand. He pulled his head a little to the side as he caught a suggestion of Misako's perfume. Careful not to meet her eyes, he glanced at her. More accurately, he glanced at her clothes, in an effort to catch some hint of a purpose that might make his decision for him. Unfortunately, he had not been paying much attention to her clothes lately. He knew vaguely that she gave a great deal of attention to them and was always buying something new, but he was never consulted and never knew what she had bought. He could make out nothing more revealing than the figure of an attractive and stylish matron dressed to go out. What would you like to do? He asked. It doesn't really matter. If you're going, I'll go too. If not, I can go to Suma. You've promised to go to Suma? Not really. Tomorrow would do as well. Seated stiffly, her eyes fixed firmly on the spot 2 or 3 feet over Kaname's head, Misako began buffing her nails. Today was not the first time they had been faced with this difficulty. Indeed, whenever they had to decide whether or not to go out together, each of them became passive, watchful, hoping to take a position according to the other's manner. It was as if they held a basin of water balanced between them and waited to see in which direction it would spill. Sometimes the day passed without their coming to a decision. Sometimes at the last moment they suddenly knew what they would do. Today was little different, however. Kaname sensed that they would finally go out together. His refusal, even so, to be a little more positive was not entirely a matter of perverseness or laziness. He thought of their tense trips alone together, no less tense for being, as today, only the 1-hour trip to downtown Osaka. He sensed too what Misako wanted to do. She did not have to go to Suma, she said, but there was not much doubt that she would rather go there to see Azo than be bored at the puppet theater with her father. It seemed necessary somehow to bring her feelings out into the open. Misako's father, yeah.
I'm just noticing that you're pronouncing his name Kaname, which I believe is the correct way. I believe it was accent on the second syllable, but I had forgotten it.
I just pick any pronunciation.
Yeah, well, you picked incidentally the right one. Let me just take the final paragraph here. So, Misako's father had called from Kyoto the day before and asked if the two of them would join him at the theater. Misako had been out, and Kaname had been rash enough to say that they probably could. As a matter of fact, he could not very well have refused. Let me know the next time you come down for the theater, he had remarked once in a somewhat hypocritical attempt to please the old man. I haven't been in much too long myself. He had evidently been taken at his word. Then too, quite aside from the play, it was not entirely impossible that he and Misako's father might not have another chance to talk at their ease together. The old man, now nearly 60, was in retirement in Kyoto, where he lived the life of the conservative man of taste. While Kaname's own tastes were rather different, and he was often enough annoyed at the old man's displays of connoisseurship, still the latter had played the gallant in his youth, it was said, and there remained something open and easy in his manner that Kaname found very attractive. The thought that soon they might not no longer be father-in-law and son-in-law gave him considerable regret. In fact, he sometimes told himself ironically, the regret at divorcing his father-in-law might be somewhat stronger than the regret at divorcing his wife. And though ordinarily such an idea would not have troubled him, he wanted one last chance to demonstrate his sense of filial duty. Right. I remember the first time reading this. I don't know what your initial response was, but the fact that the divorce was introduced specifically in this totally oblique way, hidden behind this idea of puppets, hidden behind this idea of filial duty, and also just kind of like, almost like sarcastically, right? Like, oh, I will regret not being married specifically because I can't be around this guy, right, anymore, right, as opposed to missing my wife, right? And that also just totally kind of sets into context some of those earlier comments, right, about, this balancing of this basin of water between the two. Not only is that kind of like, it's obviously kind of like a bit of an Asian sort of image, but the idea that, we're talking about it possibly spilling one direction or another, right? The spill, I think, encapsulates pretty nicely the kind of interactions, right, that the two have. And we don't exactly know, right, yet, Summa, right, what all this is referring to, but we know that something is up, right? So, I mean, like, what were your responses when you first read that, right? I mean, I definitely thought it was very, very cleverly constructed.
It is, and it's just, I thought it was a very good characterization of him with all the indecision. It's just, there's a constant theme throughout the book. It's his indecision. Yeah, and you get thrown into it. You don't know what is this Summa stuff. You get a sort of a picture of this father-in-law. All of these things will be undercut later on in the book, but it's a good opening, and the image of the water basin, which is about to spill, is very good, I think, and we'll come back towards the end, which will have it. It will have his resolution, so to say. Yeah, and it is sort of wryly funny. The regret at divorcing his father-in-law might be somewhat stronger than the regret at divorcing his wife. The book has lots of these lines that are sort of funny in that way.
Yeah, there's actually some humor here that I didn't pick up on before that we're going to get to later, like when Kaname is sitting around just really obsessed with this modern edition of the Arabian Nights in English. Yeah. Right. And how he gets like totally lost in it, not because there's any kind of artistic quality he finds, but he's just searching for dirty passages. Yeah. Right. And he's also like, he strikes me as a man that's he's honestly not even all that interested in sex, right? It may be like sex of a peculiar sort, but there's something oddly asexual about him, despite the fact that he is so, highly sexualized, right? And also, I'm not sure if you picked up on this, but like, well, we hear for the first time, right, reference to the father-in-law, and he's called the old man. I don't think he's ever named, right? He's just called the old man. Like, what'd you think about that detail? I mean, we're going to talk about the father more later, but what do you think about that detail?
Yeah, so that I noticed that too after my second read, and I think it's so Kaname has this idea that he wants to grow into becoming that sort of person. So, I mean, that was my take on why he wouldn't actually name him by name.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I actually didn't think of that. It could be like a little bit of a fear, right? He sort of like makes fun of this man, but he also sees himself like, you know what, like, where's there to make fun of? Like, I could definitely see myself this way in the future, right? But he's also not even 60, right? So it's kind of like the old man. And like it kind of starts in this way where it's there's something very idiomatic about it, right? You hear that all the time, or like, oh yeah, like my old man or this old man. And that could be like maybe a bit of a kind of a colloquial introduction, but we never get past, right, that colloquial introduction. It always remains, part of that. But like, I don't know, like, what do you think about, like, there's this like really elaborate, like almost like a page long paragraph of just talking about his clothes and Misako's sort of involvement in that. Like, Kaname was careful about his clothes as Misako was about hers. Particular kimono required a particular cloak and a particular sash, and each ensemble was planned down, even to accessories like the watch and chain, the wallet, the cloak cord, the cigarette case. Only Misako understood the system well enough to be able to put everything together when he specified the kimono he would wear, right? And it just sort of keeps going and going, right, about all this, like were you thrown off by any of these sort of like early, almost purely aesthetic discussions?
Yeah, but they do feed into the characterization, I think, as in there's all this talk about how they're modern and how they're they want to leave all of that not behind, but they want to seem more westernized and everything, and that just they are still like conservative with a small c. Even they don't really have the self-awareness to see that they are that.
What makes you say that even here you're getting like a sense that they're kind of conservative?
Well, this is more after, like, in my second reading, there's this character, the Hideo Takanatsu, who's like a more modern man. So when he comes on, there's a definite contrast between like the modern and the ancient that's more pronounced, and that's when I picked up really on this passage, or multiple passages which seem to go, which are a bit like frilly. They don't seem to actually contribute to the narrative or the characterization, but actually, if you look a bit deeper, there's that. It is just good characterization, I think, of, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even something like, there's something about the fact that this is like a wealthy family, right, without even like a real job description or anything like that, right? It's going to, on the one hand, create maybe some of the problems of leisure that we see. Like suddenly, they are, their eyes start wandering for other partners, right? Their whole kind of like interpretation of sex, at least Kaname's, is very much tied into just like highly sort of like specific experiences that he's had, or like interpretations of women, or what he might see about himself or in others, like whatever. There's definitely like room for this kind of self-indulgence, but also just by the mere fact that they have so much and just like no ability to even like waste it seems, that's going to create like a ton of conservatism, kind of like, I think, psychologically, right? There's going to be this sort of inertia, right? Even if it's going to be kind of like in this, Kaname, like later he starts to recede into a puppet show or whatever, right? He starts getting fixations on, this or that, Western edition of a book. Still, right, there's this kind of like this idea that there's really not that much more for him to do, not much more for them to go. There really isn't that much left for there to be explored, right? In a way, like being that bored in life, you're sort of starting from the assumption that there's really nothing more out there, right? You're just bored with life, right? You've sort of seen everything, experienced everything, and just having access to so much that he has, it doesn't allow, it doesn't allow him to actually, truly explore anything, right? Like it seems like his wife, right? Like this is another odd part. Like, do you notice like some of the negative commentary towards Misako by Kaname or the old man? Like, did you notice some of that? Like some of those like stray comments?
Well, they aren't entirely positive on her, and she seems to bear she seems to be the guilty party
Yeah,
for
exactly.
the old man. And when also I think Kaname is a sort of has this sort of a manipulative streak with her, wherein he, well, first of all, he lets him be clothed by her. She serves this sort of servant role here, despite them having maids and maids, so they have servants for everything. But also he uses her, so it's an affair, it's an open relationship, as a sort of leverage to well, basically to guilt trip her. Yeah. And
like what? In what ways do you think she's either made to feel guilty or he tries to make her feel guilty? Like, what'd you notice?
Well, there's this part where she confesses to him that she has an affair, and he is all hot. Well, he's the good guy and says, "Well, you can have it because his marriage isn't working." But there's like an undertone of like, you owe me for everything. You can't just separate from me. I'm still controlling everything, despite never saying any of that. He's very, oh no, but I'll let the solution come to me. He's a very passive man. Everything has to come to him instead of him making the decision. And he uses that against her. And he sees it as something that's good on his part, because he wants to stay friends with her, and he wants the son not to be like stressed about a divorce. But her indecision is a little bit more understandable, because she will lose her son if she divorces. She will lose her status in society more than him, because she will, if the affair comes to light, she will have a ruined reputation, which is very hypocritical of him, because he has a bunch of affairs too, and lusts all the time.
And maybe we talk about this near the end, right, where there's a kind of sit down with the father-in-law and Kaname, right? And he does say a couple of surprising things, one of them being like, "I think you're in the wrong, Kaname," right? But when they start discussing this idea of like free choice, free will, right, in the context of having affairs, open marriages, and a test trial to see whether or not you want to divorce, right? And he says there really is no free choice in the matter. Right. One thing that I want to explore as we read some of those passages later is just this idea that how much of this is based on just the idea that, well, this is the way the society is set up, right? Where an exploration on her part is going to simply be more punished by society, right, than whatever explorations that he has. Right. The worst that he has to worry about is when he sees his prostitutes is he needs to make sure that he doesn't smell of a certain like powder or whatever. Right. So that he doesn't cause any kind of like, either a fight or just kind of like, resentment or whatever.
And even there, he kind of tries to push the envelope by having his palms still have the smell of perfume. So it's those little glints of his, manipulativeness that come forward.
There's just like passive aggressive quality, even if and I think this is partly, maybe this like innate with some of the kind of like more, Japanese style aesthetics, right? There's this kind of the classical thing where there's going to be understated description, understated characterization in many ways, right? But it lends itself nicely to the kind of character who is in fact passive aggressive, but takes a lot of pains to maybe present himself as otherwise, right? As though, I'm not passive aggressive, right? The whole kind of Japanese style, creates that tension nicely, and it emphasizes, one of those elements while kind of like trying to pull, in some ways like a Western sensibility, like, because that's the thing, like, there's a whole kind of like cultural west-east pull within the book, obviously, but stylistically, right, there's very much something like that going on as well, right? That is worth mentioning. So I mean, like, structurally, right, this is how we begin, right? We have a chapter that within a couple of pages we hear about the divorce, but it's done in a way that's kind of like almost humorous and throwaway. And I mean, you could be reading it and you could easily miss that line if you were careless, right, and not exactly understand the import, right? I've definitely picked up on lines that I missed, right? I had forgotten the whole line. It was like, Kaname says, "Oh yeah, I need to show up at the office once a week," right? And sort of like everything that says about him. So I mean, structurally, this is how we begin. The chapter ends with them asking about, like, all right, we're gonna, so what's happening with Suma, right? Are you gonna telephone Aso, right? This is the first time that we hear this guy's name. Later on, we learn that this is in fact Misako's lover, right? And this is her sort of trial, right, to see whether or not she would prefer being with another man over Kaname. So this is how we end. By the time that we get to the second chapter, those kinds of like hints of aesthetic trappings, whether it's in clothes or whatever else, they really come to the fore, right, by way of the puppet theater. And you start noticing a change also within Kaname himself, right, where he's kind of like more interested quite suddenly in the puppet show, right? Before, it was supposed to be a favor for his father-in-law because he loves to see these shows, but now he's genuinely intrigued. Within the kind of the confines of this kind of specific, universe within some Prefer Nettles, why did you think that he suddenly had this kind of maybe this like newfound appreciation, right? And by saying that, like, we don't exactly mean that this is necessarily great art or high art, or even if it's like good puppetry. I mean, we don't know anything about it. But what do you think about it, like diegetically, like within the universes, within the book, within the universe of the book? Like, why do you think he was more interested suddenly?
Again, it feeds into the character, as in he's trying to escape his, because he's being pulled in two ways.
Mm-hmm.
Like the more Western way or the traditional Japanese way. And there you see him kind of, well, it's not succumbing. He willingly chooses the path of lesser resistance.
Mm-hmm.
As in, that's what these.
That's a good point. Yeah, I mean, he's already in that area, right? And the father-in-law is there. He's like, oh, wash this, and he's just kind of, maybe this is just passivity where he's just kind of going along with it. Yeah.
Also, it's not in this puppet chapter, but in the next, he says he doesn't really watch it for the plot, which or the characters. He just watches for the movements. Mm-hmm. There's not even a sense that he even really understands what's happening on stage, because the shows that they are watching, they could be a commentary on his situation, mm-hmm. with his marriage, like love suicide. But the only thing that he sees is the superficial aesthetic quality of everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's interesting because even if the author doesn't necessarily know this himself, or like a film director or whatever, right? Sometimes I do wonder, to what extent, when I perceive Woody Allen, for instance, making fun of bad art in some of his movies, I wonder if Woody Allen himself actually perceives himself to be doing that. Mm-hmm. I believe that he is, right? And I think there's, objective information to say that whatever the, personal intentions of somebody like Woody Allen, right? You could see something like, the lead character in Manhattan, when the opening lines are like essentially him, writing about the power of the city over him. And he says stuff like, is like coiled up with sexual energy, like a jungle cat, that to me, like whether or not someone might feel that that's a good writing as they're doing it, right? That clearly to me is a giveaway. But here, right, there's this interesting kind of thing where I definitely know other Tanizaki novels where he does get carried a bit too away with his own aesthetic fixations, right? And he doesn't necessarily let the aesthetics be used as a means of characterization. It just kind of like exists for its own sake. But here, like you mentioned, like, okay, there's this passivity with Kaname, and he's kind of like moving along to the show because it's there, but also just like psychologically, right? He starts to maybe go further and further, receding further and further into himself, into some sort of past, right? He likes this kind of weird mix of women that are both traditional, but also, highly sexual. Like it's just this totally incoherent thing, right? That in some ways, he might have just constructed this highly elaborate aesthetic game for the sake of not, dealing with a real woman in a healthy way, right? Because that might be difficult.
No, there's this discussion of the places, so like the cities themselves, that also show this character, like the Osaka is seen to be this rough, coarse culture, but it is the emotionally healthy, it seems, because people actually talk to each other, they're open, whereas the Kyoto culture is seen as more elegant and more high culture, but it's clearly like emotionally cut off. And somehow all these people think that is the way to follow. I think Tanizaki does show here that the Osakan way is the better one, but that's what I concluded from it. He gives enough arguments for that to be the case.
Yeah.
But
one thing that I notice about any kind of like arguments that he presents is there's always, any set of like counter arguments, or like it's not a complete argument, right? Like the old man, right? He's presented in the first two chapters in a totally kind of comic fashion, right? So he has O-hisa, his mistress, and she's presented a bit kind of comically too, almost like she's not like a real person. And in the first two chapters, it's like, Kaname is essentially, although we have a third person omniscient narrator, it's not, I don't want to say it's not totally omniscient, although it sort of veers into that sometimes. Like it says, for instance, something like, if Misako did X, Y, and Z, Kaname would have probably done, whatever else, right, as a result, right? And that's an interesting kind of thing to notice, simply because you are in that case treating human beings as essentially a probability space where no one is really required to behave a certain way, right? You just have probabilistic outcomes when it comes to people, right? That's a nice kind of touch when it comes to humanizing characters, but specifically like leading into chapter 3, like we only have all the secondhand commentary about the old man, right? Like he's describing who he is. Kaname is trying to present him as a comic figure, perhaps like pitiful almost in some ways, even if he envies him in other ways. But it's only after they sit through the puppet show and Misako was like, I don't want to stay here, I want to leave. But it's only after they sit through and chapter 3 begins, right after the show ends, where for the first time the old man gets to speak, right? And there's this kind of mix of like, all right, we're kind of confirming the things that Kaname has thought about him, but also there's new things that are being introduced about him that will, in some ways, presage what's going to happen later, which is, the old man actually has a lot of interesting wisdom and a lot of understanding about the conflicts between modernity and between, the ancient world, that kind of thing. So, uh, uh, notice how like when they first start talking in chapter 3, right? When Kaname says that like I really did enjoy myself, and the old man says, I don't expect you to enjoy yourself, but it does you no harm to see something like this at least once in your life. And he responds, I'm enjoying myself thoroughly, though. Why do you suppose it is? I see a great deal I missed before. And the only response the old man gives is as follows. They're almost These are almost the last of the great puppeteers. I wonder how it'll be when they are gone. Right? It's like a totally oblique answer. He doesn't try to answer for Kaname whatever is going on psychologically. It's almost as if like the old man believes that the puppetry itself has like a strong psychological component, almost kind of like a subjectivist kind of view, right? And he's sort of like almost like encouraging him to see further, right? And this kind of oblique statement about the great puppeteers, we don't exactly know what he means by that, right? And I think in some ways, rather than like spending a lot of time just exploring, the art in this kind of direction, right? We're just sort of left. It's kind of like oblique, a commentary by way of tangents.
Mm-hmm. And this also comes back later on when he discusses the songs that O-hisa has to learn how to sing, and how they're they're a bit obscure in meaning.
Yeah, I don't really remember that part. Can you elaborate?
So this is like in chapter 9 or something like that, when they're on the Awaji Islands.
Mm-hmm.
And the old man has O-hisa, his mistress, learn all of these old Osakan songs. But they are very obscure in meaning, as in you have to work to get something out of them. But it could also be that there's just not much like his answer here is like, it's either encouraging Kaname to look beyond that, or there isn't actually anything there. It's just obscure, to just purely obscure.
I have something on page 35. It's different in your edition, but when Misako is being like discussed right in this context, so she's also doing, I guess, a little bit of work with instruments. So Misako had recently taken to practicing the Tokyo samisen to dispel her unspoken sorrows, and its clear, thin tones arouse in Kaname a feeling of pleasant intimacy mixed with the regret. The old man argued that the Tokyo style was uninteresting except in the hands of a master. The amateur, he said, tended to drown out the overtones in a dead clatter as his plectrum struck the taut leather face. It was true, of course, that the Osaka tones were fuller, but Misako said, and Kaname agreed with her, that Japanese music was simple and one-threaded in any case, and that the lightness of the Tokyo style did not weigh it down as the grossness of the Osaka style did. When they discussed Japanese music, Kaname and Misako always formed an alliance against the old man. What do you think of that passage in relation to music, and also especially that final line that almost seems to totally come out of nowhere, but I think is the sort of critical line here?
Well, the thing is, its commentary on music that seems to say something meaningful on just instrumental music seems pretty difficult. But that last line is, I think, what leads into the next paragraph, that he's always going on about young people today. Mm-hmm. He's in some way a sort of old boomer type who's like stuck in his old ways, and he has all of these fanciful ways of explaining it, but not actually understanding it on a more deeper level, that it has to go forward, like artistically.
I was struck by it. Reminded me of when I did that thing with Joel Parrish on Steppenwolf, where you had Harry Haller essentially like he sees a painting of Goethe that he doesn't like, right? Because that's the thing, we can only say that he doesn't like it because he doesn't really give a true artistic explanation for why this or that thing fails, right? But it just kind of shows maybe their own, personal sensibilities, right? And you have the same idea here, right? He's fixated on personal responsibilities, but I mean, I do find that line in that paragraph, the closing line, maybe the most interesting. When they discuss Japanese music, Kaname and Misako always formed an alliance against the old man. Like, I mean, would you think of that when you read it? Because it was pretty startling to read.
Well, I see it more as a line that was just that plays in the past, in their past, as in they would always, not gang up on the old man, but they are clearly of the modern sensibility. They're sort of the mirror opposite of the old man who's stuck in his old ways, but they are purely stuck in new Western modern ways. And that's why they have to fight the old man, despite not making really any arguments why it's good or bad. It's just, we're young. And that's also the reason they give for their divorce, is that they don't want to waste their youth. They want to be free and be young. And that's the reason why they gang up on the old man instead of like, they don't have a good discussion or anything. It's walls closed off, and it's one against the other. Yeah, that's how I read it.
Yeah, it's interesting that we have this like, almost abstract thing, right? That in a sense brings them together simply because of the kind of like highly, I guess, symbolic quality to it, right? What it allows them to see not only like in themselves and about each other, right? But also, it's kind of becomes like a means of like self-justification, right, as the novel goes on, right? Why are you behaving this way? Well, let's just look at the old man's feelings about music, and that should kind of explain everything, right? Doesn't it? So. I mean, that was definitely an interesting kind of a detail. So in the next page, right, we get into Kaname's kind of like fixation on a peculiar kind of woman, and also by extension, also, I guess, a kind of art. And I think the fact that, he's even able to confuse the two so easily, right? A person and a work of art, right? I think that kind of says everything, right? So it's part of it's actually a paragraph that lasts for almost 2.5 pages, right? So in discussing the arts, right? Not that Kaname found the scent an entirely repulsive one, right? We're talking about like the merchant class. He had grown up in the merchant section of Tokyo before the earthquake destroyed it, and the thought of it could fill him with the keenest nostalgia. But the very fact that he was a child of the merchant's quarter made him especially sensitive to its inadequacies, to its vulgarity, and its preoccupation with the material. He reacted from it toward the sublime and the ideal. It was not enough that something should be touching, charming, graceful. It had to have about a certain radiance, the power to inspire veneration. One had to feel forced to one's knees before it, or lifted by it to the skies. Kaname required this not only in works of art. A woman worshipper, he looked for the same divine attributes in women, but he had never come upon what he was looking for either in art or in women. He only harbored a vague dream, and its very refusal to become a reality made his longing the keener. I mean, there's a few interesting pieces here, but one thing that immediately jumped out to me is just in the fact that both tackling and understanding the arts, as well as learning how to healthily exist in a relationship, they're both pretty difficult things to do, right? Many, if not most people never manage, right? Isn't it just kind of wonderful to see all the kind of roadblocks, right, he puts in front of himself to essentially, be able to not do either, right? Like the title, right? Like Some Prefer Nettles, right? Such a beautiful title. The original Japanese is something like, it's like the first half of a phrase about like
water pepper eating bugs.
yeah, like yeah, the water,
Yeah.
yeah, like something about water bugs that eat peppers or whatever, right? And they love peppers, right? And here, right, he's kind of, because of this difficulty up ahead, right, whether it's in the arts or in women, right? Let's sting ourselves and hurt ourselves in order that we don't have to deal with this other thing that he assumes is going to be so much costlier or even more difficult, right? And at a certain point, like the kind of roadblocks that you set up are even worse than the thing itself, right? That you're trying to avoid. I mean, that's the whole thing about procrastination, right? As a rule, it's kind of like a preventing you from experiencing the pain of something that you want to do. But by the time you get to that thing that you do have to do, you've created so much more pain in the process, right? So in some ways, like the story is not too different from that concept, but what do you think about this whole kind of introduction of Kaname as like a woman worshiper, either in this passage or similar passages? Because there's a few little comments like this.
Well, it just shows that he has a sort of black and white mind. I think he's not able to see subtly as is necessary to appreciate art or like be in a relationship, because he just sees the woman as either it's the trope of Madonna whore. She's either a mother or she's like a prostitute, and he can't see beyond that. But like you said, it is like a roadblock that he himself also puts in there to never actually have to deal with anything. It is the path of the least resistance, but it will come up as having the biggest problems later on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think about, so like chapter 3 ends with Misako essentially, okay, so now they're done with the play. They're done with his father-in-law, right? And she gets in a cab to go to Suma to see her lover. And chapter 4 begins with this letter kind of out of the blue. And there's a few little devices like this in the text from Takanatsu, right? I believe that's his. What is that? Is that his brother? No, his cousin. His cousin.
Yeah.
I believe that's Kaname's cousin. What do you think about this decision, right? Maybe we could just like read the letter too, that was sent to a character that's been like a total cipher until this point, right? Hiroshi, which is it's the child, right, of these people, but we don't, and despite the fact that they're home all day and don't do anything, we don't really see or hear much about him other than we don't want to we don't want to ruin his vacation, or we don't want to say anything to him about an impending divorce, right?
And actually, of Kaname, it is said that like once a week he has to go to his office, but then like once a month he has a fit of helpfulness where he brings his child to school.
Yeah.
Which
yeah, to say that, I forgot. I maybe I have it somewhere in the notes, but I probably would have never found it. But I remember reading that part for the first time, not for the first time, but I mean I read it before. But it really kind of like struck me how, so like, all right, so like we keep hearing that Misako is, like there's something wanting in her character, right? Like when the third person omniscient narrator says something like, going into Kaname's head, it was something like, and Misako's character being what it was, ... And then later on, right, we have the old man. He says something like, I can't like defend or something Misako's character, but really, I don't see, I don't see too many negatives within her character. That's the odd thing, right? Like a lot of this is clearly like, even if there's supposed to be this like moment of wisdom of the old man or whatever later on, even if there are things you could legitimately criticize all characters, a comment like that, right? Like he goes into office once and once a week, and then once a month he decides to do something for Misako, right? And that's brought out because Misako, it's like a Sunday morning, and she's sort of like laying around in bed until noon, which she doesn't get to do all that often, and she really tries to bask in it at the time. Whereas Kaname seems like he's always just laying around. It seems
Mhm.
like, the book opens up with like, he has like a hand on his chin reading some sort of fucking like trash book or whatever, right? Or some
Mhm.
kind of catalog. And he's always just kind of like laying around, and she's not, right? She's obviously like a time waster in many ways too, right? She's a dilettante in many ways, but it seems like for all the kind of trappings, and I mean, we get this later on, right? For all the trappings of modernity, right? There's definitely a domesticity that she's not only forced into it as a woman, but she also seems to generally be interested in some of it, right? She's not just doing it just to do it. She's doing it because she seems to get some level of enjoyment and value out of it, right?
Mhm. Yeah, it seems that Kaname, he can speak English, but it's kind of implied that he only learned it by visiting prostitutes, where she
Mhm.
goes to like she meets her her lover in a French class. So she makes this, she does take decisions. She's not like
Mhm.
Kaname at all. But she is painted like with a very, I mean, there is sort of misogynistic brush that she doesn't do anything, or she's just, even the I think the wisest character, the Takanatsu, even he says that women are just fools. They don't
Mhm.
really know anything.
Yeah.
Uh, and here Tanizaki does give, like, he does say that these women do stuff. They're not just ciphers, or they're not just dolls. There's actually a complexity. There's life to them than just being some play toys.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a good distinction, right? Because when you say that she's being painted in a misogynistic fashion, it's not Tanizaki himself that's doing that, right? It's, if when we voice the thoughts of a Kaname, right? Or whoever else, right? It's specifically from that perspective. Right. But he himself, like just kind of an aggregate, right? That whole totalizing picture is definitely, it's different, right, from what the individual people within, even Takanatsu, like it's true that he's a more wise than others in some ways, although like I was waiting, like, all right, so we have all this wisdom, there needs to be something that comes out that kind of shows the kind of complications all these characters have. And of course, like later on, right, we have that about the comment that he has about women. But he's introduced for the first time in chapter 4, right? With that letter. Um, so I mean, let me just quickly read it. So, dear Hiroshi, right? So this is the first time that like their son gets actually addressed, but it happens to not be by them. Or the examination's over. I expect to be there during your vacation. And what shall I bring you? I have been looking for your Cantonese dog, but there doesn't seem to be one in the city. Shanghai and Canton might as well be in different countries. I have been thinking I might bring you a greyhound instead. They're very popular here. Suppose you know what a greyhound is, but I am enclosing a snapshot anyway, right? And then he says, tell your father that I found his copy of the Arabian Nights, right, which turns out to be like a dozen volumes or something,
Mhm.
and extremely expensive. And one thing that I found interesting here is how, so like the dog comes and Hiroshi is like so excited about it. Like Hiroshi is presented in a way where he's able to understand kind of what's going on around him, but also there's definitely a sense that he might be on his way to becoming kind of like Kaname, right? And, kind of like maybe through no fault of his own, because he is very much being spoiled, right? Like, so this guy comes and he brings him a greyhound, and although Hiroshi's very excited to have this greyhound, you're made to think that this is his first pet or something, but it's only like many chapters later that it turns out that they already have a dog inside the house that we also don't completely hear about. So not only so like the kid is excited about the prospect of a new dog, he's getting spoiled in every kind of direction, and they're so kind of like full of time that it's almost as if like like this other dog doesn't exist, right? Like we don't even have to hear about it. There's probably so many rooms and so many maids and so many this and so many that like it was just a funny kind of detail where, and I'm sure like Tanizaki, I can imagine himself like laughing to himself where he's like, yeah, I'm gonna now talk about this what do they name that dog, like Lydia
Lindy.
or Lindy, or like, yeah, like Lindy, or like something like, yeah, I'm gonna talk about this other dog Lindy so many chapters later. People are like, what, there's a dog, right? But that's also kind of like a very kind of understated, maybe Japanese style humor. But I mean, there's something very funny about that. But also, it's not just funny for the sake of funny. It's very characterizing of everybody involved. Also, of Hiroshi himself too, right? Even like the kids aren't allowed to essentially be innocent. I mean, we see, right, the parents essentially kind of like fucking up this child in many ways. But I don't know, like this. Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, they're fucking him up in a sense that they want to protect him. There's this it's pretty funny passage when Kaname always procrastinates on telling his son about the divorce because, well, the weather isn't good, or we can't do it during on a school day because then he'll have to go to school and he won't have any fun, or we can't do it in the fall because then he will be sad and will be reminded of the ephemerality of everything. But in the end, it's the uncle that tells him, and he's fine. He can process it on his own, and he's much worse off not being told than being told. It seems his parents don't really have a high all that high an opinion of his processing capabilities, his his, it's not intelligence but just like emotional intelligence, I guess. In a way, they also see him like the men see women a bit. It's all very, he's a bit dull, like yeah. No, it just kind of explicitly show what's more implicit in the rest of the text, where she bears the brunt of the weight of like the household jobs. And there's also a doll festival coming up, and she has these these Japanese dolls in her basement or something, and she absolutely hates them, but she keeps them for her father. It's more sort of to please him and not her, because you see her doing all this emotional labor too. So the shutters had been left closed. I'll read that one. Okay, so the shutters had been left closed to let Misako sleep late. She could tell from the light coming through above them that it was a bright, warm day, the sort of day that made one think of peach blossoms and the doll festival. She wondered whether she would have to get out all those dolls and arrange them on their tiered stand again this year. Always fond of festival dolls, her father had ordered a set in the old style from Kyoto shortly after she was born, and she had brought them along in her trousseau. She would as soon leave them buried in their closet if the choice were hers, since she had no daughters and she was not the sort to go through old routines for their own sake. Difficulty was that her father was so near. Each year when April came, he was taken with a sentimental yearning for the dolls and hurried down from Kyoto to see them. He had done so last year and the year before, and he most probably would this year too. It was not the prospect of dragging all the boxes from the closet and wiping away a year's dust that bothered her. That she could stand well enough. It was rather the thought of another ordeal like the recent one at the theater. Could she avoid bringing them out this year, she wondered? Maybe she should talk the matter over with Kaname. And what would happen to the dolls when she left this house for good? Would she take them with her? She could leave them with Kaname, but that might not be pleasant for him.
Yeah, and it comes later to like she's like, okay, now I have to entertain this new guest, Takanatsu, right? She because again, the duties are going to fall on her. And it says on Sunday mornings when there was no school, she would have enjoyed staying in bed herself. But even then, Hiroshi was up at 7 or so, and she felt she ought to at least make a gesture toward looking after him, right? And it's a kind of like odd mix of first of all, like it kind of like plays with maybe your own kind of like readerly responses, right? So like first of all, why is she the one that has to do all of this? Given the fact that neither of them seem to really be working, right? She doesn't seem to have that many domestic duties, and he has, very few work duties. Why isn't there some kind of split going on, right? But also like this idea, she felt she ought to at least make a gesture toward looking after him, right? Is this really a matter of appearances? What exactly are her own feelings for her son? Are they in any way complicated towards these like odd feelings towards her husband, right? And later on, it says the sleeping medicine she sometimes took in the afternoon only made her more alert and wakeful than ever. Once a week, Kaname had to show his face at the office in Osaka, and sometimes perhaps twice or three times a month, perhaps not that often, he would often have a fit of helpfulness and see Hiroshi off to school himself. So if the reader is just kind of like, maybe there's like a slightly like misogynistic response in the reader where they're like, she's a mother. Of course, you should be loving him. Of course, you should be taking care of him. Of course, you should be getting up. But if you had that kind of twinge of like, all right, maybe I'm a little less empathetic towards her after hearing of this gesture of, being a mother, you don't really get that anymore, right? That gets all washed away with the commentary and Kaname, who you might have assumed at this point, he might have done some kind of work. Maybe he's some kind of businessman, maybe like whatever. But at this point, you realize that no, he's working only once a week, if that, right? Probably not even a full day, and barely has to do any kind of like domestic duties towards his son. So they're both kind of like in their own way, a bit neglectful, and he perhaps more neglectful than she is, right? So again, like just like beautifully, subtly constructed, like what happens at the middle or the beginning of a paragraph could totally change in meaning by the time you get to the final sentence, right? And that's very easy to miss, especially if you're not a reader but a skimmer.
I think it's also mentioned quite in the beginning that he's a director of some sorts, Kaname. So it is strange how you need to be able to make decisions, I'm assuming. So it is strange how he got that high a position without doing any work, which makes me think that he actually he's from the merchant class because he has all of these little memories of when he was younger, and he's like firmly entrenched in the merchant class. So him being a director of sorts makes me think he just married rich with this Misako, and the fact that that could be like another reason he doesn't want to divorce, but the fact that she has the affair and he's sort of the moral winner, that gives him like even more power over her.
Yeah, I've actually not speculated too much on Kaname's origin. So, like, let's say he is from the merchant class. I mean, do you think? Because I just always assumed that he probably inherited a lot of money, as well as lots of family connections that would allow him to get this kind of job, right, where he doesn't have to show up more than once a week, and just say or do some bullshit and then just depart. I never really considered this other idea of him marrying into perhaps Misako as well, because it does seem that Misako, right, her own father, obviously, right, seems to be a man of leisure in some ways, right?
Mhm.
His kind of like I don't know how early that kind of retirement would have been, like in his late 50s. But it's early enough. I'm sure there are plenty of Japanese people, working into their 60s and maybe even 70s at that time. Given that lifespans probably were still a bit higher there compared to generically the West, even then. But yeah, I mean, it's a possibility, right, that he did do the marrying but also like they're sort of like worried, right, about Misako's future, right? Like, what if Aso abandons her? Like, what is that going to mean for her? So who knows, right? A lot of it, I think, is it's a good decision on Tanizaki's part to
Mhm.
kind of leave it open ended. I mean, he himself, I believe, was from a merchant class. A lot of these experiences were like he saw an earthquake that ruined his home, and this kind of like affected him psychologically, right? There was this kind of like a loss of money later on in his kind of like teenage years. But maybe it's just kind of imagining like what would happen in the situation of total, self-indulgence if none of that transpired, right? And you could
Mhm.
imagine something that maybe he would have never become a writer, right? If it was just about pure self-indulgence in his life, who knows? Do you want to just get to, I guess, that middle section where they're just talking about?
Yeah, the well, it begins with him reading some notes to the Arabian Nights
Mhm.
about the customs, like Arabian customs, like they thought a gap between the teeth is a mark of beauty in Arab culture.
Yeah. But
And
notice how he says like many of these details. It says many of them were concerned with linguistic problems of little interest to Kaname, but among them he found some that described intriguing Arab customs or suggested something about the contents of the text proper. Right. So, and the example is a large hollow navel is looked upon not only as a beauty, but in children it is held as a promise of good growth. Um, slight parting between the two front incisors. The upper only is considered a beauty by the Arabs. Why it is hard to say, except for the racial variety. So he's looking for like sexual content, right? He wants to learn about the sexual customs of Arabs and
yeah,
stuff like that. And it's funny,
the
like the chapter 8, which is like probably I'd say it is like one of the like hinge like fulcrum chapters of the text, right? It's like right in the middle of the book, right? It starts at page 93, right, and it ends at like page like 10, yeah, 109. So like the whole middle section of the book now is taken up by chapter 8, but it starts with him just kind of like just so fixated on this text. Um
and
the bird, yeah.
he stops. Well, no, so it says Kaname drew up short. Here it was finally, and quickly reread the last footnote. Lane is scandalized. So he sees this word scandalized and he thinks, oh yeah, I'm gonna get my fix.
Yeah.
Uh,
And that's the thing. Like he has to read this with an English dictionary. So like he's like, all right, it would take me too long to actually read through the entire text like this. So I'm just gonna skim through until I get to like the sexy parts. And I think it just captures the psychology very well. And also just the fact that like suddenly now we're here with like he gets interrupted by Takanatsu, right? Who's like, all right, we need to talk about Misako, right? I just heard a rumor, right, that Aso maybe is not going to stay with her forever, right? They both agreed to this idea that maybe their own love is going to fizzle down the road, and we need to deal with this because we need to be responsible, right? And then we get into like a very kind of elaborate discussion of their past and Misako's crying jags, and like some of the psychology I think is very well done, especially in light of the very final chapter. What was there something about this chapter particularly that you wanted to discuss?
So this comes after a chapter wherein Takanatsu and Misako talk, and she, well, confesses to him that Aso is not really willing to make a commitment. So her lover is not willing to make a commitment to her
Hmm.
because he doesn't know how he's going to feel in a year or 2 years, um, which is very much in line with something like that Kaname would say, or the old man, or something. Well, not the old man. Well, no. Um, anyway, he
Yeah,
gets,
but it is something that Kaname would say, right? And it's both this kind
yeah,
of it's both highly modern, but also totally non-committal, right? Is there something about Misako's psychology that she seems to be drawn to two men that are in some ways very similar, right?
mhm. um, so he has this talk. Hideo has this talk with Kaname, and that's the first thing he really throws on the table. Like she has no support
Hmm.
because of that. Kaname says, but does a decent man make promises just to please a woman? Isn't it more honest to refuse to? Um, Hideo, I don't like that sort of honesty. It's not honesty, it's lack of steadiness. Kaname, you have your nature,
You
others
know
have
what that
theirs.
reminded me of? Like I remember one time I was dating someone very briefly when I was like 15 years old. And she said she said something about like going on dates with another guy. I'm like, what are you talking about? She was like, "Oh, I was just trying to be honest." I was like, "Being honest? Wait a minute.
Yeah,
This is the honesty. Like, it's not like a positive for you in any way, right? To simply like the real positive is to like not do it, right? Um, and
yeah,
it remind me of that, like that you know you could definitely you could reach adulthood and still kind of like think in that way. So I also thought that was a pretty perceptive comment on his part. Yeah,
yeah. It's a sort of honesty without responsibility. It's
yeah,
again,
yeah. One night, as she lay in bed with the covers pulled up to her forehead, he heard her sobbing quietly. Long into the night, he lay staring into the darkness of the room, listening. It was not the first time he had been assailed by the sobbing in the night. A year or two after they were married, when he was beginning to withdraw from her sexually, he had often enough had to meet the same accusing evidence of the woman's wretchedness. He knew what it meant, and he felt intensely sorry for her. At the same time, he was conscious of being pushed farther from her, and at a loss for a way to console her, he let the sobbing pass in silence. Would he have to spend the rest of his life with it? Who knew how many years? The prospect made him long to be alone and free. Gradually, she seemed to accept her loneliness, however, and the sobbing stopped. And now, after years of respite, it had started again. Kaname at first doubted his ears, then asked himself how to account for this extraordinary development. Why should she have started again? What case should she be pleading now? Had she never resigned herself at all, only waited for the day when his affection for her would return, and now, after years of waiting, had she found it impossible to wait any longer? What a fool the woman was, he thought, and as years before, he let the tears pass in silence. But night after night, they continued. Quite unable to find an explanation, he finally told her she was making a nuisance of herself.
yeah. What case could she be pleading now? It's a pretty funny way to think of, like, she's crying again after she has cried for so many years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the only thing that he can think of is that she's attacking him somehow. What case is she pleading with me now? It's again, it's a, he doesn't engage with her. He only thinks she's kind of attacking him for something.
Yeah, there's like
Yeah.
an almost kind of like an abstracted quality to it, right? Where it's kind of like, there's a rhetoric here, there's a set of arguments here. What exactly are
Mhm.
they, right? There's, it's just extremely distant emotionally, um, beyond anything. And so, like at that, Misako broke into open and unrestrained sobbing. Forgive me. There's something I've kept from you, she said softly, her voice choked with tears. Right. And she's talking about the fact that, there's this affair, right, that's happening with Aso, right? And she does say, Misako said that the affair had gone no farther than declaration of affection, and he saw no reason to doubt her. Even so, her confession seemed enough to cancel out the debt he had been carrying, right? Again, back to the comments about manipulation, right? This idea that, everybody has like a set of behaviors within the context of a marriage, right? Everybody is doing something or not doing enough of something, saying something, not saying enough of something, and they're kind of keeping all these tallies. Or rather, he seems to be keeping the tally, right? She seems to be interested in having a husband that loves her and is able to show this kind of affection, right? He's more interested in these kinds of tallies as a way to either create, either the kind of, the grounds for a divorce or to assuage guilt. And it seems like very much a lot of this is that personal guilt, right? Yeah, this burden, right? The burden being he feels like he can't be a good husband to her because of his weird expectations when it comes to women, and the fact that he cannot be sexual with her in any way after the first couple of years.
Like further on, there's a set of principles.
So after they're now ready to discuss the possibility of a divorce, right? So maybe get into that set of principles.
Yeah. Kaname recited the set of principles he had been carrying, nicely composed in his mind. 1. To satisfy appearances, Misako is for the present to remain Kaname's wife. 2. Similarly, for the sake of appearances, Aso is to be for the present a friend only. 3. To the extent that it will not arouse suspicion, Misako's love for Aso, both physical and spiritual, is to be given free license. 4. If after a period of 2 or 3 years it appears that Misako and Aso are affectionate and compatible and are in prospect of being happily married, Kaname will take principal responsibility for gaining the consent of Misako's family and will formally relinquish her to Aso. 5. This period of 2 or 3 years is therefore to be considered a testing of the affections of Misako and Aso for each other. If it appears that the test has failed and that the two, because of incompatibilities which have emerged, could not make a successful marriage, Misako will remain in Kaname's house as she has to now. 6. If happily the experiment is a success, Kaname will continue to regard the two as friends after they are married.
Yeah. Again, this kind of like weird contract, and the way that it gets set up, this contract, right? Before we get to the enumerated list, speaking of like Misako, if one was always looking for something better, then of course there was no end to one's demands. But the world was full of unfortunate wives, and Misako, unloved but with little else to complain of, could not find it in her to make that alone the reason for abandoning her husband and child, right? And then basically the way that Kaname describes it is, with us, I suppose, is that we're more afraid of what's in front of our noses than of what's still a distance off, Kaname said with a laugh. At the end of the conversation, Kaname came to his proposal. We'll have to arrange, he said by way of preface, so that we'll be drifting into a divorce and hardly knowing it. It's such a funny line, right? But like you could read it and not necessarily laugh, right? But it's such a funny line.
This whole book has this sort of funny quality because of the frustration that goes on. I mean, if it's this, or he can't decide a moment to announce a divorce to his son, it has to be the perfect conditions. It's so so stupid, so frustrating that it becomes, well, pretty funny actually. But
I think the way that
Yeah.
the title, presents it, some prefer nettles, like it's innately humorous too, right?
Mhm.
Like the title itself it's not the kind of humor that you necessarily laugh out loud at, but it's the kind of, non-laughing humor, right? There's objectively a humor there, right? In recognizing that, oh, look, people are walking around in life doing all kinds of things to make their own lives difficult for, whatever reason in their heads, right? The funny part being that that reason in their heads is totally insufficient for the behaviors that they're undertaking. Um, so yeah, and I mean
Mhm.
this is the kind of like middle chapter, right? For anybody that has read this book or is going to read this book, I would tell people to really pay attention to this chapter as a fulcrum, especially if you're somebody that wants to be a writer, and try to really understand how it works as a kind of pivot point, right? Because it's so easy to miss with something written like this as as seamless. Yeah, so I mean, after that pivot point, right? There's another kind of structurally interesting decision, right? Where for the rest of the book, most of it is just about this falling deeper and deeper into the puppetry, a grown kind of fixation with O-hisa, and maybe even like Kaname's own envy, about the old man. Like he almost feels like, I want a relationship like this, where, I'm just massaged late into the night and I go to sleep and that's that, right? And I could have a woman that more or less looks like a doll and behaves like a doll, right? Of course, the revelation later on is that she's not like a doll. She's actually a more complicated person,
Mhm.
and that he himself seems to go through some kind of transformation near the end. But what do you want to say about this kind of growing, like this deeper and deeper kind of descent into his own mind? I mean, even when he visits the prostitute near the end, that is also very much like, although like he's with another person, that seems to be like in some ways the most kind of like entrenched into his own brain, compared to like almost any, even in more the kind of like abstract discussions of art or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, like, what do you think about like the direction that the novel goes after, after all this?
Uh, well, it seems that he just doesn't know how to. He doesn't do anything with his life, and that's what gives him this. Well, he lacks a sense of purpose, and
Mm-hmm.
instead of looking for one, uh, there's plenty of ways to begin, like in his nearby environment. There's his wife, whatever, his son, but he only knows how to go even deeper. He only knows how to go further the wrong end, so to have even less purpose in life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's
Like,
yeah.
did you find the discussion, like with the prostitute as kind of like, did it disturb you in any way? Because when I was reading it, I was like, the Some Prefer Nettles title really came to the fore, just gauging their interactions, and it made me think, why the hell does he want anything to do with this woman at all? Like, even even if she satisfies you sexually here in this kind of like once a week or whatever it might be, or even if you're really into foreign women, like it seems totally absurd, right? It's kind of like this like swing of an arc, right? Character arc from someone that you might feel kind of empathetic towards and likable to, totally like, it's almost like a denuding of a prostitute. You know what I mean? Where it starts with these like enigmatic little stories about like, oh, she's like this expert linguist. She's able to do this and sing and dance and so many wonderful,
Mhm.
talented things. Why am I wasting away in this kind of, in this brothel? Um, but then it's like revealed, well, she probably grew up speaking, these languages simply because of her ancestry. Um, and then this kind of, this total like demand for money, right? It becomes like, you see how transactional it is. And in some ways,
Mhm.
like, it's also interesting because like the reader could respond to that in a somewhat, misogynistic way, like, oh, this dumb bitch, you just want my money, huh? But at the same time, it's like, well, okay, look, you're dealing with a prostitute. This is her job, right? She's not here to placate all these other parts of you, right? You're here for a service, and yet it's really Kaname who has all these elaborate fantasies about her, elaborate fantasies about her past, elaborate fantasies about some kind of potential future. And when he's like, it's you don't know whether or not he's going to see her again, but it seems to me like he might ultimately come to the resolution that he wouldn't, although he comes to the resolution a lot. In this passage here, like let me get to it. He's basically imagining what she would look like as a as a wife, right? And he does not like the image of her as a wife, right? This is how he imagines her, right? Kaname rather enjoyed putting her off, but he could not deny that her proposal interested him, meaning like to be like his mistress forever. She was not the sort of girl who would want to stay long in one place, and he was quite sure, joking aside, that one, but her name is Louise, that one day she would run away to Harbin, perhaps. That, however, might be rather a relief. What bothered him more was the thought of how complicated it would be to set up a mistress. Louise said that she would be satisfied with a rented Japanese house as long as it had Western furniture, but somehow, even assuming that she could to outward appearances give up her luxuries and take to minding her accounts like an admirable housewife, the picture of her coming into a narrow little room through an ill-fitting door and walking across the puffy insubstantiality of badly made flooring, her bobbed head emerging from a wifely cotton kimono, somehow the picture had its disenchanting aspects. I feel like here, not only her aggressiveness, but also imagining her as a wife or wifely in some ways, like totally maybe puts him off of her forever. I mean, like, what were your impressions? Because that was fairly, because like we don't know anything about his like visits to prostitutes until you get to that chapter, right? And it almost comes a little bit out of nowhere, but it's also very functionally important and also just a lot of parts beautiful. What'd you think about his interaction with Louise?
Well, I also think that passage that you just read, it's also this Western element put into the Japanese environment, which freaks him out. That's why he's always like, he's reaching, it's more obvious towards Western stuff just to escape himself. And it's more like she's kind of his drug or something. Like a couple of paragraphs later, he said that each time he was seen to the door and into a waiting cab by the boy, Kaname made the same resolution, and as he turned to look back at Louise, blowing a kiss from the door, he secretly said goodbye forever. But strangely, the resolution never lasted 3 days. By the 5th or 7th day, the desire to see her again was quite out of control, and no matter what the complications, back he came running to Kobe. So Kobe, the city where she works. So he's addicted to her. So it's like he's a drug addict and he can't stop getting his fix. I
mean, when I was reading that, I definitely thought like this really captures a sort of like boredom of something like alcoholism, or maybe like the boredom of drugs, the boredom of, I mean, like I remember we were talking before about, you mentioned how like you're often like on the phone or like on gadgets more than you'd like. For a lot of people, and for me included, a lot of like getting off of gadgets or whatever just came about through like, I'm just bored, right? Or like times in my life where it's like I've been like way too stressed over something, or things are just like difficult in some way, or just going through personal shit. Like if I find myself like either like eating a bit too much and I gain maybe like a few pounds, or like smoking too much weed, a lot of the way that reverses is not some sort of like, okay, I have to stop, right? I just get bored. It's like, okay, what the fuck am I doing? Right, next, right? I'm in this like little haze or whatever. Now it's time to move on, right? I had my haze, and after this haze, there's nothing more to say, nothing more to do. But one thing that's fascinating here is just watching their interaction in the book. It is fascinating that he has not gotten bored of her at this point, right? She doesn't seem to be. I'm not sure if this other side of her came out just now or if it was always there, but not only is just kind of like alarming, but it's also just boring, right? I mean, especially when you figure out the enigma, especially after his suspicions about her past kind of come to, fruition in some way, at least in his own mind, right? Wouldn't that be a recipe for boredom? Why doesn't that sort of like trigger some sort of like impulse to stop? Not the guilt, not the whatever, but just, this other kind of almost like animalistic sort of, boredom, right? Well, maybe that's not animalistic. Maybe animals don't really get bored, but the more kind of like human ennui, right?
But he keeps seeing her as a mystery because it's said that she has like this, she's from Poland or something, and then she picked up those languages, and that's why she's good at Japanese. But he makes, in his mind, she has Turkish blood in her. She's a sort of exotic queen. And then even afterwards, he says, well, she's such a gifted linguist. She should do something with that instead of be stuck in prostitution. So you would have a hard time finding a woman like her, even in Paris. Whereas I think she's just a normal, not very remarkable woman. Mm-hmm. But he does make her this sort of enigma, so he can stave off being bored with her. Mm-hmm. It seems.
No, maybe, yeah, that's a good. I mean, maybe he does know, like deep down, that boredom is just always around the corner, right? And he does need that enigma. So I mean, like we're getting close to the end of the book, right? And so everything sort of comes to a resolution a couple ways. So Takanatsu, he ends up telling Hiroshi in Tokyo about an impending divorce, and I guess part of the reason why I said that there's this almost like Kaname like quality in Hiroshi is in the fact that after he was told about the divorce, he was very upset, but then the next day, right, he was almost back to normal in some ways. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it was kind of like placated by consumption, right? He like bought a bunch of shit in the store and it's like, all right, now I feel good, right? That's not explicitly stated, but it's kind of like a way of staving that off. And the fact that he has access to be able to do that, right? Like any other kid, right, dealing with a parental divorce would not be able to just, I think the quote was, buy the entire store to then feel better. So this is how Hiroshi learns. So it's like, all right, now they don't have a reason to stave this off further. Kaname sends a letter to his father-in-law describing what transpires. And they're saying we might get a divorce. This is our plan. So his father-in-law immediately says, all right, I'm going to come, right? He writes a letter that seems to be very upset. He's like, okay, I'm going to come right away. And we're going to have this discussion. So this is ultimately what happens, right? And I think this is a critical chapter. Like if you were to leave the old man as he was thus characterized already, you'd have a fairly empty, comic character, maybe comic relief, but not. There's like more subtlety to him, I think, even if you reread the book in light of what you learn later. But on the first reading, right, it would feel a little bit hollow. But here, like, how would you characterize like the changes that maybe not the old man goes through, right? He maybe goes through no changes at all, but the changes that he imparts to the reader in terms of what the reader knows about him then versus what happens upon this visit.
Yeah, so he's more characterized as he was a gallant in his youth, and now he has this young girl as a mistress or wife, I don't know. But in those last chapters, it actually transpires that he has like principles. He has a way of seeing the world, and even his like his mistress O-hisa, he says, well, we may not be a good match, but we've been together for so long, and you develop a sort of it's a deeper kinship, or something that is the core of a marriage, basically. And that's actually mentioned fairly in the beginning too by Kaname. He like analyzes his marriage, and then, oh, but we should remain married because people develop this bond after being together for so long.
What do you think about that specifically as a principle? This kind of like marriage as long-term cultivation of like some sort of affection, even in the midst of some or even substantial problems elsewhere. There is a kind of like old-time hokey wisdom to it that I think could easily get lost.
Yeah, that you have to like work at it, and like to do maintenance on it.
Well, not even just that, but like that it could be, I mean, the whole kind of like, cliche of the past being like, people get married and they just sort of stick it out, and the bond emerges because of that, right? And it's not really about love. I mean, do you think there's anything to that? Because I mean, I think most modern people, like, they wouldn't stand for a loveless marriage, right? Unless they absolutely have to.
Well, I think that's what the book kind of shows. There's a loveless marriage, which they should be gotten out of, as opposed to maybe ideally what he describes as a marriage that has its ups and downs, but that there's that strong connection, and it's not a loveless marriage. The love just becomes something deeper and something that is not glamorized at all has never been glamorized, maybe. So there is some truth to that, but those people haven't lived it, it seems. Although there's no mention of the old man's, I guess, his wife, the mother of Misako. What that was, she must have died, or maybe they also got a divorce. But I don't.
I think she died. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe he gleaned that wisdom from there, like taken in the light of Hideo's comment, like, it's not honesty, it's a lack of steadiness. And so this old man certainly says, well, it is steadiness. So I don't know, my response is that he definitely is wiser than you think of him, and that Kaname does not really understand him. He once again looks at the old man very superficially and gets out of it, oh, a young mistress, or lazing about all day, smoking a pipe. It's more a sort of, it's again a characterization of Kaname not being able to see deeper, like what is behind the facade of the old man, living his life like that. And it's not a, oh, I'll do whatever I want kind of thing. He developed these principles. He worked for his principles, as opposed to Kaname. Despite there not being that much of an age difference, as the old man is only in his 50s and Kaname must also be like 40 maybe. It shows negatively on Kaname again. Yeah.
Yeah, there's this like even at the beginning of so like when he gets so like when the old man basically confronts him about all this, right? This does surprise Kaname in some ways, right? When he's like, all right, do you want me to explain further than what I said in my letter? The old man says, no, I understand in a general way. But Kaname, if you want my opinion in a word, I say you're in the wrong. So for the first time that we get in the book, someone here is, actually blaming Kaname, right? He seems to go through life without sufficient, without sufficient problems, right? Like Tekanatsu's previous letter to Misako from the chapter before, it ends with, this is what he says: "The way through life is not always smooth, and it is good for a boy to have his troubles. Indeed, Kaname himself has had all too few. A really serious blow might teach him to pamper himself a little less," right? And that has always stuck with me, this idea of I like, after reading that like 10, 15 years ago for the first time, I was like, do I pamper myself too much? Like, is this like a thing, right? This is this is a phenomenon that I guess people go through. And I didn't really understand it too much then, but I do understand it more now, right? There's definitely ways that you could be that are way too sparing of yourself. And I think the phrase "sparing of yourself" might be, is that Nietzsche? Is that something else? But it's like a variation of the same kind of idea, right? This idea that you are pampering yourself in some way.
It is a good like litmus test of your own maturity. Because I read this book like in my early 20s, and then you see some stuff, but now you get the emotional maturity from it a lot more. So lots of wisdom to be gained if you engage properly with this book. So it's like we don't get that much criticism of Kaname until that letter, and also the chapter 14, the last chapter, and he says you're in the wrong, right? And Kaname is like very offended by this, right? That for the first time someone seems to say that to him. So I think it's worth reading what the old man says in full. "I suppose that is a little too strong, but don't you think you put too much faith in what you call being reasonable? The times are what they are, and I can't keep you from treating your wife as if she were another man of the world, I suppose." Right? And I mean, this is something that we get all the time, even now, right? I think there's definitely something to the idea that men and women should, over time, approximate themselves, each other more and more, rather than becoming more and more distinct. But the fact is, like, men are men, women are women. If you understand that, really, that's probably going to cause fewer conflicts for you in whatever relationship that you might engage in. People might not want to hear it, but that is a fact, right? There's certain things that men want and crave. There's certain things that women want and crave. And there's also a lot of overlap, right? The moments of overlap are great. The rest is give and take and mutual understanding, right? So you shouldn't be surprised, though, if you find it doesn't work as you think it ought to. But let me come to the point and forget the preliminaries. You had Misako choose another husband on a trial basis because you didn't have the qualifications yourself. That's not very realistic. You talk about being modern, but there are some things you simply can't do in that free, open way of yours, right? And he starts describing, like, I've known marriages like your marriage in the past, right? So he himself, the old man, is dipping into the past to show that, this isn't a new problem, right? My wife and I were that way ourselves, as a matter of fact. None of your 1 year or 2 years, sometimes for 5 years at a stretch, I never went near her. But she just assumed that was the way things were, and there was no problem. The world has come to be a much more complicated place when you think about it. But if you send a woman away, even for a trial, and she discovers halfway, though, that she's made a mistake, then she's in the predicament of not being able to come back, no matter how much she may want to. Talk of free choice all you like. There's no free choice whatsoever in the matter. So, I mean, a couple of things. Like, first of all, he's not just misogynistically saying that, I used to not come to my wife at all for a while, right? And this was the norm. He says, the world now has changed. It's different, right? He is wise enough to acknowledge that you can't have a relationship as easily
along these parameters, and compared to maybe like a half century before, right? It's a lot harder to have a sexless marriage now than it might have been a long time ago, right? So he's aware of all this, right? But again, like we mentioned this earlier, talk of free choice all you like. There's no free choice whatsoever in the matter, right? And it makes me wonder how much of this is this idea of like a social stigma, the woman can't come back. How much of it might be, there might be bits and pieces of it that are kind of like biologically ingrained, right? This feeling of like, that's it, I've sort of like ruined it and there's no way to kind of like turn it around. That's not all social engineering, although obviously a lot of it is. But it doesn't the interesting thing here is that it does not exactly give you those answers, right? You could, as a modern person, right, be someone that is kind of like, I pay attention to the social engineering, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, right? Social engineering has gotten like a bad reputation for whatever reason, as if everything is not social engineering when it is. I'm interested in, like male, female, what those differences in fact entail outside of the kind of, caricatured, cartoonish version of maybe Jordan B. Peterson, the way that he might present such things. But these are interesting questions, and I could have my own set of answers here. You could have your own set of answers. Someone reading this in 1929, right, would have had a different set of answers. And a century later, right, we could still come up with something new, with something different, right? And there's definitely a kind of like visionary quality in terms of how he presents that kind of psychology, right? He says, time will pass and you'll find that you are very much suited for each other after all, right? I do think that relationships over time, you should grow progressively more and more and more compatible, right? If that's not happening for you, if you're growing less compatible, or if those core issues are not resolving, well, that's a problem, right? You should be growing more compatible as time goes on, right? There should be based on mutual understanding. And finally, this last part, where he says, but of course, Misako has been unfaithful, and I can't blame you if you tell me that I'm talking nonsense. And then he says, please, that has nothing to do with it. She had my permission, and it's not fair to call her unfaithful. And I love this line, but unfaithfulness is unfaithfulness. I only wish you told me before it came to that, right? I mean, there's definitely something to it, permission or not, right? There is like I understand, like there's like modern like polyamorous couples and all this other shit going on, but the fact is, like, if you're talking about a relationship which is difficult, a marriage which is difficult and requires time, if you are just kind of arbitrarily just seeing random partners and this and that, you are providing less time and investment into your relationship. That's a fact. Because if you're on a date with somebody that's not your wife or whatever, that is time that you could have spent on a date with your wife. That is time you could have spent reading a book together and talking about it, watching a movie together and talking about it, right? These are all things that factually, objectively strengthen your bond if you do have any kind of complexity in your head, right? I mean, you may take issue with the way that, but unfaithfulness is unfaithfulness. You may take issue with the way that's being presented, but there is definitely a depth and wisdom to a lot of what he says, even if, and this is, I think, the critical part, he's not somebody, the old man is not somebody that you would look up to, is he, right? The idea of a 59-year-old, whatever he is, dating a 21-year-old, it's just, I'm not going to do the whole modern thing of calling him a groomer, calling him a predator. No, he's just kind of like a stereotypical, old man creep, right? And a lot of people are like that. But also, it's hard for me to, it's hard for me to see O-hisa as in any way as a victim here, because when she spends time alone with Kaname, right? And he sees her for the first time as a human being, and she's like making fun of the old man. She's being critical of him, not in a way that's vicious or anything. She's just like realistic about, like, she knows that she's 21 and she knows that he's 59 or whatever it is, right? They understand this. They've come to some sort of understanding. It could be, financially based. It could be something else, like whatever it is. They've come to some sort of understanding. There might be some maturity there, but also, he's not somebody to aspire to either, right? I think it's important to be able to give characters, right, these kinds of depths.
He wants an O-hisa type as a mistress, but like an more O-hisa than O-hisa herself. And this comes just before like the revelation that O-hisa herself also has a bit of a personality, and that she's kind of bored with all the education the old man gives her.
And I think it's in another chapter where basically he's this one. So Kaname is just kind of like looking around his house, right? And this is what he says, or rather, this is what he thinks. Lying on the matted floor, Kaname looked with new interest at the mellowed woodwork, at the stand in the alcove and the trailing branch of bright yellow flowers, at the polished wood in the hall reflecting the light from outside like water. For all the excitement of her love affair, Misako still changed the decorations in the Japanese rooms now and then, the hangings and the flowers, to harmonize with the changing of the seasons. No doubt she did it from inertia and habit. Still, when Kaname thought of the day when the flowers would disappear, he knew that even this lifeless marriage, like the sheen of woodwork seen and remembered morning and morning again, was something so near and so familiar that it would continue to pull at him even after it was gone, right? Like there is that kind of enduring domesticity, right? She wants to be modern, but it's always going to be there, right? She's going to want to do some of these things. It could be as simple as she wants to maybe have Kaname return in some way, but the fact is, like, that pull is there for him and it's there for her. And as much as he himself, he wants to combat this idea of like, I'm so bored of the kind of, matronly, wifely wife, right? But, there's clearly the deepest kind of attraction is not to, Luis or any of these other prostitutes. It seems to really be for this, right? And there's this kind of very mysterious ending where he seems to be like in this mosquito net, a rain starts, and you don't know if he at some point fell asleep or what, but he asked O-hisa to bring him a bunch of books, like these old style woodblock books. And she
Japanese
comes out,
books, yeah,
ancient
Japanese, yeah.
And you don't know actually if she's the one that comes out, because there's also this kind of like phantom voice that he like thinks like, oh, is there some kind of argument that's going on between Misako and her father, right? This kind of like phantom argument that he maybe imagines, or maybe he does hear it, right? And this is how the ending is characterized. A gust of wind came through the open window and the shower began. Kaname could hear large drops falling against the leaves. He raised himself on an elbow and stared out into the wooded depths of the garden. A small green frog, a refugee from the rain, clung halfway up the fluttering side of the net, its belly reflecting the light from the bed lamp. It's finally begun. The door slid open, and this time half a dozen old-style Japanese books in arm. It was no puppet that sat faintly white in the shadows beyond the netting. So, well, like, what'd you think about that ending? I mean, there's so many things you could say about it, but like immediate impressions or whatever.
Well, first I thought the shower began was a sort of nice full circle, because the novel begins with that image of the basin of water about the spill. And then there's him being trapped inside of the netting, finally giving into that, all those old Japanese books after like the whole book is littered with like Arabian Nights, there's Western style books. And now it seems like it's like an image for him fully going for that, that Japanese traditional conservatism, but also just even further into himself. There was no puppet that sat faintly white in the shadows beyond the netting. Uh, that he even seems like puppet-like.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. It could be a reference to him. It could be a reference to O-hisa. It also could be a reference, who knows, to Misako, right? In the sense that, I mean, because O-hisa was supposed to bring the books to him, but instead she's sitting in the net, beyond the netting while she's sitting down, right? It could be someone else altogether, right? It could be Misako, right? It's not exactly clear, but I mean, even this kind of enigmatic line, it's finally begun. The most literal reading, obviously, the rain. But what else could be? What else could be the beginning, right? There's this John Berryman poem that like the opening to self-portrait in a convex mirror.
John Ashbery.
Yeah, sorry, John Ashbery. Where he's talking about like the summer, right? The same kind of summer drowsiness, right? So this was all, but obscurely I felt the stirrings of new breath in the pages, which all winter long had smelled like an old catalog. New sentences were starting up, but the summer was well along, not yet past the midpoint, but full and dark with the promise of that fullness. That time when one can no longer wander away, and even the least attempt to fall silent, to watch the thing that is prepared to happen, right? It doesn't matter exactly what that thing is, right? That kind of mystery of what it is, right? We have like any number of tendrils, right? Those happenings could go into any kind of direction, but the fact that in 1929 you could have that self. I mean, I'm always amazed, right? When you look at images, right, from various time periods, right, you always have this kind of impression that they're psychologically less rich, less complex than you are. And then you do something like you read the poetry, you read the novels, and you understand that they understood more or less what you understand, right, just through a different filter. So anyway, that's Tanizaki. Definitely one of my favorite novels and my favorite of his.
What are his other novels? Because this is the only Tanizaki book I've read.
There's Naomi, which is a very good novel, but I only read that once. I don't remember it being as good as some Prefer Nettles. There's what is like The Old Man and the Key or something. I forget the exact title. Or maybe it's actually I have like it's like a dual thing. It's like the key, and then it's some old man keeping a diary. Anyway, a lot of it does tend to devolve into like kind of like lecherous old man type shit. Which this, this in a different kind of artist's hands could have easily gone in that direction as well, right? Whereas now it's like, you understand this is not a man to look up to, even if he has wisdom, or even if you might envy some parts of his life. I mean, I'm sure a lot of men, like in their kind of like most kind of like base animal instinct, they're like, yeah, 6-year-old man, let me be massaged to sleep by a 20-year-old every night. But generally speaking, like I think most people understand it's not something to emulate. All right, so I guess this is it, right? Artifact number 37. It should be artifact number 38, also a week from now, hopefully. So we're gonna keep setting this stuff out. Thank you guys for watching. Like, subscribe. We have a patron show coming up for the patrons. I think that's going to go up maybe a day or two after this one goes up. But again, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you again soon.